I came back from deployment and my wife asked, "How are you home already?" I dropped my duffel bag on the porch, confused. "What do you mean?" My deployment ended. She stumbled backward and grabbed the doorframe. "Daddy!" My 7-year-old son, Brandon, came running and wrapped himself around my legs. "You're alive! You're alive! Mommy said you died!" The words hit me like a punch. I looked at her for an explanation, but she just stood there frozen, tears streaming down her face. "I need to sit down." Her face crumpled. "Brandon, please go to your room. But I want to tell Daddy about now." I headed upstairs to check on him and past our bedroom. Something told me to push the door open and my heart stopped. There was a man I didn't recognize in my bed. "Who is that?" My voice came out cold. She looked up with red, puffy eyes. "His name is Derek." Before I could say anything else, there were footsteps behind me. It was Derek. He saw me in my uniform and froze. "Wait, you're alive?" He turned to her. "What the hell is going on?" She wouldn't look at either of us. "You showed me the obituary. I went to the funeral." That's when I realized he didn't know. "How long have you been here?" I asked him directly. 7 months. She called me in June, said you'd been killed." Derek was pacing now. "I quit my job in Phoenix for this. I had a senior analyst position coming up. Everything." "You quit your job?" Derek turned to face her. "You said Brandon needed stability," Derek said, looking at her. "I used my savings to pay for his therapy sessions. You said the military insurance wouldn't cover it." He pulled out his phone and showed me. $7,200 in therapy payments over 7 months. My eyes were fixed on the ring on her finger, one I didn't recognize. "She told me we'd get married," Derek announced, following my gaze. After enough time passed, she said Brandon was already calling me Dad and it would help him. I turned to her. "He calls him Dad." She was crying, but I didn't care anymore. "My cousin died in Afghanistan 4 years ago," Derek said. "When she told me you'd been killed and she needed help, I thought it was what he would have wanted." "You put our son in grief therapy," I said. "You made him think his dad was dead. You made a 7-year-old mourn me for no reason. I watched my platoon sergeant die in May," I continued. "He took shrapnel meant for me. Last thing he said was, 'Tell your family you love them.' That's what kept me alive." I had to grab the table. "I sent love letters every 2 weeks telling you how much I missed you, telling Brandon about where I was." Derek's jaw clenched. "You were reading his letters while I was sleeping in his bed." "Did you close our accounts?" I asked, pulling out my phone. "I tried to buy coffee at the airport and my card declined. I have $2,800 cash and no way to access anything because you declared me dead while I was still overseas." Derek stood up fast. "Where's the insurance money?" She went very still. "What insurance money?" "The life insurance. $450,000. We filed in July. You said it was going into a trust for Brandon's college." I pulled out my phone and logged into our bank account. There it was. Dozens of cash withdrawals following the insurance payout, all from an ATM by the casino downtown. "She has a gambling problem," I said flatly. She was sobbing now. "I was going to pay it back. I thought I was honoring you," Derek said to me. "Every time I helped with homework, every parent-teacher conference, I kept thinking, this is what his dad would want." She tried to stand. "I can explain." "Explain what?" Derek's voice was sharp. "Get out," I told her. "This is my house too. You declared me dead, but Derek's a witness. We both are." Brandon came down the stairs. "Why is everyone yelling?" She moved toward him, but he stepped back. "Why did you say Daddy was dead?" "Baby, I can explain. Was it all a lie?" Brandon looked between us. Derek knelt down. "Brandon, your dad's been alive the whole time. He never left you. Brandon ran to me and I picked him up. I thought you were dead. I thought you left me. I never stopped being your daddy." Derek was still on the phone. "Yes. Military life insurance fraud. Service member identity fraud." He looked at me. She grabbed her purse. "Where am I supposed to go?" "Not my problem. You figured it out for 7 months while I was getting shot at." Behind me, Derek was already on the phone to her father, an ex-Marine. I heard forensic accountant. 7 months, her dad repeated. "And you better not be there when I arrive." He hung up the phone. And when I turned to her, she was looking at me with something that said she was willing to do anything but leave peacefully. Her hand moved fast to the kitchen counter and grabbed the big knife we used for cutting meat. Derek jumped between her and Brandon while I pushed my son behind me. She was backing toward the door, waving the knife back and forth in front of her like she was trying to keep us all away. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. I told the operator my wife had a knife and was threatening us at our address. When she heard me say our street number, she dropped the knife on the floor and ran out the front door. The knife clattered on the tile, and Brandon pressed harder against my back. Derek picked up the knife and put it in the sink while we waited for the police. 2 cop cars pulled up within 4 minutes with their lights flashing. The officers came in, and I showed them the knife while Derek told them what happened. They took our statements one by one and wrote everything down in their notebooks. The female officer told me they were issuing a protective order right away. She said she couldn't come within 600 feet of the house, or she'd be arrested. They gave me paperwork to sign and said they'd try to find her. Brandon wouldn't let go of my hand the rest of the day. He kept asking why Mommy had the knife and if she was going to hurt us. I told him Mommy was sick and needed help from doctors to get better. We ate dinner on the couch watching cartoons because Brandon didn't want to sit at the kitchen table. He fell asleep holding onto my arm, and I carried him to my bed. Every time I tried to move away, he'd grab me tighter and whimper in his sleep. I stayed awake most of the night watching him breathe and checking the locks on the doors. The next morning, I called the bank while Brandon was still sleeping. The woman on the phone said my accounts were frozen because of the death certificate filed with them. She told me I needed official corrections from the state before they could give me access again. The process would take at least 4 weeks, maybe longer with all the paperwork involved. I only had the cash in my wallet to live on until then. Derek knocked on the door around 11 with coffee in his laptop bag. He said he wanted to help document everything for the police report we'd need to file. We sat at the dining room table going through emails and bank statements from the past 7 months. He showed me receipts for all the therapy sessions he'd paid for Brandon in cash every week for 7 months, thinking he was helping a kid who'd lost his dad. I called my unit's administrative office and explained the situation to the staff sergeant who answered. He couldn't believe what he was hearing and had to get his commanding officer on the line. They promised to expedite the paperwork, but warned me the military bureaucracy would still take time. That afternoon, I heard a car pull up and saw her father getting out with a woman carrying a briefcase. He walked up and hugged me tight, then pulled back and said he was sorry for what his daughter had done. The woman was Patricia Hayes, a forensic accountant he'd hired to go through all the financial records. She spread papers across the dining table and started making notes about every transaction since I'd deployed. Her father kept shaking his head as she pointed out withdrawal after withdrawal from the casino ATM. The school called my cell phone around 3 o'clock that afternoon. The principal said she had shown up trying to sign Brandon out for a doctor's appointment. She'd kept Brandon in the office when something seemed wrong and called the police instead of releasing him. The officers arrested her right there in the school lobby for violating the protective order from last night. Brandon was safe but scared, and they wanted me to come pick him up early. Derek drove me to the school while her father stayed with Patricia to keep working. That evening, a detective knocked on our door and introduced himself as Frank Patterson. He was older, maybe 52, with gray hair and the straight-back posture of someone who'd served. He shook my hand and said he'd been assigned to our case because of the military fraud angle. He sat at our kitchen table taking notes while I walked him through everything from the beginning. He asked detailed questions about dates and documents, writing everything down in a small notebook. When I showed him the bank statements with all the casino withdrawals, his jaw tightened. He said this was one of the worst cases of military insurance fraud he'd seen. He promised he'd make sure the investigation was thorough and that she would face federal charges. Derek stayed to talk to him, too, explaining how she had convinced him I was dead. The next morning, I drove to the JAG office on base while Brandon was at the school. Rachel Torres was waiting for me in a small conference room with a stack of forms already printed out. She'd seen cases like mine before, soldiers declared dead while they were still deployed, though usually not by their own wives. She walked me through the DEER system, showing me on her computer how my status still said deceased in the military database. She typed quickly, filling out correction forms while explaining each step. The whole process would take weeks to fix completely, but she could start the emergency corrections right away. She gave me a temporary letter stating I was alive and serving, which would help with other agencies. That afternoon, Derek showed up at the house carrying 4 cardboard boxes. He set them on the kitchen table and opened the first one, pulling out receipt after receipt. Every single therapy session for Brandon paid in cash because she told him the military insurance wouldn't process claims for a dead soldier's family. $7,200 total, all from his savings account that he'd been building for years. He showed me the withdrawal slips from his bank, dated right after he moved here from Phoenix. The receipts had the therapist's signature, Dr. Elena Kim, and notes about Brandon's grief counseling sessions. Derek had kept everything organized in folders by month, thinking someday it might help with taxes or insurance. While we were going through the receipts, Patricia Hayes called from her father's house. She'd been digging through the insurance paperwork all morning and found something important. The death certificate she used for the insurance claim was notarized at a check cashing place downtown, not at any official government office. She'd already driven there and talked to the owner, who remembered her coming in with the document. The signature on the death certificate didn't match any of my unit's commanding officers, just some made-up name that didn't exist in military records. Patricia was scanning everything to send to Detective Patterson and the insurance company. My phone buzzed with an email from Brandon's teacher while I was making lunch. She'd written 4 pages about how Brandon had changed over the past 7 months. She described him going from a happy kid who loved recess to someone who sat alone at lunch and cried during story time. She mentioned all the parent-teacher conferences where Derek showed up instead of her, how he asked questions about helping Brandon cope with loss. The teacher had even suggested grief support groups, which Derek had looked into. She attached Brandon's drawings from art class, pictures of soldiers and graves in dark clouds. The funeral home director called while I was reading the email. His voice sounded uncomfortable as he explained the situation. She had paid him $9,500 cash for a memorial service back in June. She'd ordered the works, including an empty casket, printed programs with my photo and flowers. He still had copies of everything in his files because something had seemed strange about the whole thing. She'd insisted on a closed casket even though there was no body, said it was for closure. He'd held the service on a Wednesday morning with about 18 people attending, mostly her friends. He was faxing the invoice and guest list to Detective Patterson's office. The next morning, I had to go to the DMV to get my license renewed since mine had expired while deployed. The clerk looked at her screen and frowned, saying I was listed as deceased in their system. She didn't know what to do and had to call her supervisor, who had to call their supervisor. They made me fill out form after form, each one requiring proof I was actually alive. I showed them Rachel Torres's letter, my military ID, my passport, everything I had. 4 hours later, they finally gave me a temporary paper license while they processed the correction. The whole time, other people in line were staring at me like I was some kind of zombie. That evening, my phone rang with a blocked number. It was Benjamin Walsh from the insurance company's fraud investigation unit. He'd already pulled her entire claim file and found problems everywhere. The claim was processed way too fast without proper verification of military records. Someone at their company had rubber-stamped it without following protocol. He was reviewing every document, finding forged signatures and fake forms throughout. He said they'd be pursuing criminal charges and would need my full cooperation. He was sending an investigator to meet with me in person next week. Later that night, after Brandon was in bed, Derek and I sat on the back porch. He started talking about his cousin who died in Afghanistan 4 years ago. His voice got quiet as he explained how her call had hit him hard, bringing back all those memories. When she said a soldier's widow needed help, he couldn't say no. His cousin had left behind a wife and 3 kids, and Derek had watched them struggle. He thought helping us was what his cousin would have wanted. His voice cracked when he admitted he really thought he was doing something good, something honorable. He'd given up everything to be here because he believed in helping a military family. 3 days later, Detective Patterson called, saying he'd gotten the casino surveillance footage. He wanted us to come to the station to see it. We sat in a small viewing room while he played clip after clip on his computer. There she was at the ATM, taking out the maximum withdrawal over and over. The timestamps matched perfectly with the insurance payout hitting her account. She'd withdrawn $48,000 in cash in just 4 days, all from that same ATM next to the casino entrance. The footage also showed her going straight from the ATM into the casino each time. Detective Patterson had even gotten footage from inside, showing her at the slot machines and poker tables. That night at dinner, Brandon looked at Derek and asked if he was leaving too. Derek and I exchanged glances, neither of us sure what to say. Brandon's eyes were wide and scared, and I realized my son had already lost his mom and thought he'd lost me. And now he might lose Derek too. Derek put down his fork and looked Brandon straight in the eyes, promising he would stay until everything was sorted out. He said he wasn't going anywhere until Brandon felt safe and things were back to normal. Brandon nodded and went back to eating, but I saw him relax for the first time in days. 4 days later, the bank finally called about my account, and the woman on the phone said they could unfreeze one checking account with just $1,800 in it. But at least I could buy groceries without using my cash stash. I drove straight to the ATM and pulled out $100 just to make sure the card actually worked, and felt stupid getting excited about accessing my own money. But after weeks of being financially dead, it felt like a small victory. That afternoon, while Derek was playing with Brandon in the backyard, my phone rang and it was Dr. Elena Kim, who had been Brandon's grief therapist for the past 7 months. She sounded uncomfortable, explaining that she had an ethical problem continuing treatment since the whole basis of therapy was false, and she needed to file reports with the state licensing board about the situation. She gave me the name of a new therapist who specialized in trauma from parental deception and said she'd already sent over Brandon's files with a detailed explanation of what had happened. I thanked her and wrote down the new therapist's number while watching Brandon and Derek throwing a football outside. The next morning, I got another unexpected call from a woman who said she was her gambling addiction counselor, and normally she couldn't break confidentiality, but given the criminal case, she felt obligated to tell me something important. She explained that she had been in treatment for compulsive gambling for 4 months before my deployment, but stopped coming to sessions right after the insurance payout hit her account in July. The counselor had records showing she talked about her gambling debts and even mentioned considering faking my death for the insurance money during a session. But the counselor thought it was just desperate talk, not an actual plan. I asked her to send everything to Detective Patterson, and she agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation. 3 days later, I met with Rachel Torres at the JAG office to file for emergency temporary custody, and she helped me fill out all the paperwork while explaining the process. The hearing was set for next week, and we spent 4 hours preparing evidence, including the fraud documentation and Brandon's therapy records, showing the psychological damage from the false grief. Rachel said the judge would likely be sympathetic given the circumstances, but warned me to stay calm and factual during the hearing, no matter what her lawyer tried to argue. That evening after dinner, someone knocked hard on the front door, and when I opened it, there was a big guy in a leather jacket asking for her. He said she owed $35,000 to his boss, and the payment was overdue, and he'd been to her parents' house, but they said to try here. Derek came up behind me, and we both told the guy she didn't live here anymore, and he needed to leave our property immediately. The guy looked at us and said his boss didn't care about our domestic problems and someone better pay up soon. Then he walked back to his car and drove off slowly like he was memorizing the house. I called Detective Patterson right away and told him about the loan shark's collector showing up, and he said this was getting more dangerous than just fraud. He came by the next morning with a security company rep and suggested installing cameras on all corners of the house, plus changing every lock since she still had keys. The security guy walked around taking measurements and said he could have everything installed by tomorrow. And Detective Patterson mentioned she might get desperate as her options ran out and the walls closed in. He advised keeping Brandon away from windows and varying our daily routines so nobody could predict when we'd be home or gone. The next week, I spent an entire morning at the Social Security office trying to resurrect my official records, and the clerk behind the counter actually laughed when she saw my file. She made a dark joke about me being the first zombie she'd ever processed, but then got serious when she saw how much paperwork was required. Form after form needed to be filled out to officially bring me back from the dead in their system, and each one required multiple proofs of identity and notarized statements. She said the whole process would take at least 8 weeks and gave me a thick packet of additional forms to complete at home. That afternoon, Derek's phone rang and it was his former employer in Phoenix offering him his old job back with the promotion he'd missed, but he had to return immediately to accept it. He looked torn as he told me about the offer and kept glancing at Brandon, who was doing homework at the kitchen table. Derek said he wanted to help us through this mess, but he also needed to think about his own future and rebuilding his savings after spending everything on what he thought was helping a widow and her son. We talked about it that night after Brandon went to bed, and Derek decided to ask for 3 more weeks before starting so he could at least get through the custody hearing and make sure we were safe. The company agreed, but made it clear this was his only chance to come back. A few nights later, Brandon woke up screaming about coffins, and I found him sobbing in his bed, saying he dreamed I was in a box underground and couldn't get out. This was the 4th nightmare that week, and when I took him to the new therapist, she explained it would take months to undo the psychological damage of grieving a living parent. She said Brandon's brain had processed my death as real trauma, and even though he knew I was alive now, his subconscious was still working through the false memories of loss. The therapist recommended keeping his routine stable and being patient when the nightmares happened, since forcing him to get over it would only make things worse. Meanwhile, Patricia Hayes had been digging through financial records and called to say she'd found something worse than the gambling. She had opened 5 credit cards in my name while I was deployed and maxed them all out for a total of $48,000 on top of what she'd gambled away. Patricia had copies of the applications showing my forged signature, and the cards were all sent to a P.O. box she rented just for this purpose. The debt was already in collections and destroying my credit score, even though I'd never seen these cards or made any of the purchases. The custody hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday, and Rachel helped me prepare a thick folder of evidence, including the forged death certificate, bank statements showing the gambling withdrawals, and Derek's receipts for all the therapy he'd paid for. Walking into that courtroom felt surreal because just 3 weeks ago, I'd been dodging bullets overseas, and now I was fighting for my son in a different kind of war. The judge was an older woman who'd served in the Air Force, and when she saw my uniform, her face got serious real fast. Rachel presented everything methodically, while her court-appointed lawyer tried to argue that she'd been under extreme stress and made poor choices, but never intended harm. The judge flipped through the evidence, and I saw her jaw tighten when she reached the therapy notes describing Brandon's nightmares about his dead father. She asked her directly if she'd told her 7-year-old son that his father had died, and she just nodded while crying. The judge didn't even need to deliberate and granted me temporary sole custody with her getting supervised visitation twice a week pending the criminal case. 3 days after the hearing, her public defender called my cell while I was making Brandon breakfast. He said she would plead guilty to the fraud charges if I'd support probation instead of prison time because Brandon needed his mother, even if she'd made mistakes. I told him I'd think about it, but honestly, I was too angry to even consider it right then. That same afternoon, I was driving past the pawn shops on Oak Street when something made me pull over and check them out. The second shop I walked into had our wedding ring sitting right there in the display case with a yellow tag showing it had been there for 4 months. The owner remembered her bringing it in because she'd been crying and desperate for quick cash, and he'd given her $900 for a ring that cost me $4,800. I bought it back for $1,400 and stuck it in my pocket, not really sure what I was going to do with it. Derek had been staying at the Holiday Inn down the road, but he came by every day after work to help with Brandon's homework and all the paperwork that kept piling up. He told me he'd extended his return to Phoenix by another month so he could testify if the case went to trial, and his old company was holding his job but getting impatient. We developed this weird routine where he'd show up around 6 with takeout, and we'd eat together while Brandon told us about school. Then Derek would help him with math while I dealt with phone calls and forms. The insurance company sent a formal demand letter requiring full restitution of the $450,000. And Benjamin called to explain they were pursuing criminal charges regardless of what I wanted because fraud of this magnitude couldn't be ignored. He said they'd already filed with the federal prosecutor since it involved military benefits, and the FBI might get involved, which made everything feel even more overwhelming. Brandon's teacher called asking for a meeting, and when I went in, she said the school counselor recommended keeping his routine as stable as possible despite everything happening at home. She offered to give him extra help during lunch and said she'd noticed him starting to participate more in class activities after weeks of being withdrawn. She had this gentle way of talking about it that made me realize how many people were trying to help us get through this mess. Detective Patterson called saying he needed to interview the notary who'd signed the death certificate and asked if I wanted to be there when he questioned him. We met at the police station where this nervous guy in his 60s admitted she had paid him $600 cash to notarize the document without proper verification from the military. He kept saying he thought it was legitimate because she was crying and had other paperwork. But Detective Patterson just took notes and said falsifying government documents was a felony. My military pay finally got reinstated, but Rachel warned the 4 months of back pay was tied up in processing and could take another month to actually hit my account. She filed expedite requests with 4 different offices, but said the system moved at its own pace regardless of personal emergencies. In the meantime, I was living off the $1,800 from my unfrozen account and the cash I'd brought home, which was running low fast with all the legal fees and daily expenses. Her father asked me to meet him and Patricia at her office to discuss the financial recovery plan. And when I got there, they had spreadsheets showing every debt and fraudulent charge. Even with full restitution from her, which we'd probably never see, it would take years to restore my credit score and pay off the $48,000 in credit card debt she'd racked up in my name. Patricia said we could dispute the charges, but it was a long process and creditors would still come after me in the meantime. That night, after Brandon was asleep, Derek and I were sitting on the porch, and things got awkward when he pulled out his phone to show me something. He had dozens of videos from the past 7 months, including Brandon's 8th birthday party, which happened while I was deployed. In the videos, Brandon was blowing out candles and calling Derek Dad and opening presents I'd never seen. Derek kept apologizing, saying he thought he was doing the right thing. But watching my son call another man Dad while I was getting shot at overseas made me have to walk away for a minute. When I came back, Derek was putting his phone away and looking at the ground. The next morning, Detective Patterson called saying the district attorney was taking over the case since military insurance fraud made it federal, and that meant she could face up to 25 years if convicted. He needed me at the courthouse next week to testify before the grand jury and warned me to bring all my deployment papers and copies of the insurance documents. I spent 4 days organizing everything into folders while Brandon was at the school, and Derek helped by making copies at the library since I didn't have a working printer yet. The grand jury room was smaller than I expected, with just 19 people sitting in rows looking at me, while the prosecutor asked questions for 3 hours about the timeline and showing them the forged death certificate and bank records. The prosecutor pulled me aside afterwards, saying they were confident about indictment, but warned that she might take a plea deal to avoid trial, which could mean less prison time, but guaranteed conviction. That same week, Brandon's new therapist called me in to look at pictures he'd been drawing during sessions, showing 2 stick figures labeled Daddy and Uncle Derek, standing next to a smaller figure that was him. She explained Brandon was processing the confusion of having 2 father figures and that it was actually healthy he could distinguish between them now instead of the mixed-up grief he'd been carrying. Brandon asked her if it was okay to like both of us, and she helped him understand that Derek was tricked too, and that sometimes adults make terrible mistakes that hurt kids without meaning to. The supervised visitation happened that Sunday at the courthouse family room with a social worker watching everything and taking notes. She spent the whole hour trying to tell Brandon she was the victim and that Daddy was being mean to Mommy. And the supervisor stopped the visit after 35 minutes when Brandon started crying. The supervisor wrote in her report that she showed no accountability and was attempting emotional manipulation of the child, which would be filed with the court immediately. 4 days later, my back pay finally hit my account. $14,200 that let me hire a civil attorney who specialized in fraud cases and identity theft. He said we could sue for damages beyond just the stolen money, including emotional distress for Brandon and the costs of therapy and credit repair, which could triple the amount. Derek called me that afternoon saying a company downtown offered him a senior project coordinator position after seeing his Phoenix experience on his resume. He wanted to stay in town and asked if I'd be okay with him being part of Brandon's life like an uncle since Brandon had gotten attached to him over those 7 months. I told him I'd think about it, but honestly, I was already seeing how Brandon smiled when Derek picked him up from the school twice a week while I was dealing with lawyers. 3 weeks later, the grand jury indicted her on 16 counts, including wire fraud, identity theft, forgery, insurance fraud, and theft of government property. Her father called me that night, saying he was done paying for her lawyer after seeing the evidence, and that she needed to face the consequences of what she'd done. The federal public defender would take over her case, but everyone knew they were overwhelmed and wouldn't fight as hard as a private attorney would. Monday morning, I went back to work at the base for the first time since returning from deployment, and everyone already knew the story from base gossip. Some guys from my unit offered to help with anything I needed, while others kept their distance, like they didn't know what to say to someone whose wife faked their death. My platoon sergeant pulled me aside and said to take whatever time I needed for court dates and lawyer meetings, and that the unit had my back through all of this. Brandon's teacher sent home a note that Friday, saying he'd had his first good week without any crying episodes or angry outbursts. She wrote that he actually laughed during recess when playing soccer and was participating in group reading for the first time in months, which felt like actual progress. That Sunday afternoon, her public defender called about a plea negotiation where she'd admit to some charges in exchange for dropping others and recommend 7 years instead of 25. The prosecutor called me an hour later saying the negotiation fell apart because she refused to admit full guilt and kept insisting she was going to pay it back eventually. They decided to take it to trial, which meant a longer process, but also meant Brandon might have to testify about what his mom told him when she said I was dead. I spent that night on the couch looking at deployment photos on my phone and thinking about how different everything was supposed to be when I came home. The next morning, Rachel Torres called early and told me to come to the JAG office right away because she'd gotten through to someone at the federal level who could fix my records. I drove there still half asleep and spent 5 hours signing papers while she worked on 4 different computers at once, calling various offices and using military codes I didn't understand. She pulled up screen after screen showing my status changing from deceased back to active duty, each system update taking forever to process, while she explained that credit bureaus would be a whole other battle that could take years. By lunch, she had most of it sorted, but warned me that random systems would still show me as dead for months, which meant I'd have to carry documentation everywhere, proving I was alive. 4 days later, Derek called asking if I'd be okay with him taking Brandon to a basketball game that Saturday, since he'd already bought tickets months ago, when they thought I was dead. I met them at the stadium, and Brandon was wearing the jersey Derek had gotten him, looking confused about whether it was okay to be excited with both of us there. We sat through 4 quarters, barely talking except when Brandon asked if we were friends now, and Derek looked at me before saying we were complicated friends, which actually made me laugh for the first time since getting back. The forensic accountant Patricia testified in a deposition the next week, laying out spreadsheets showing how she had opened new accounts 3 months before my deployment and started moving money around in patterns that showed clear planning. She pointed to specific dates where she had researched life insurance policies and military death benefits, even bookmarking articles about how to file claims, all time-stamped before I'd even gotten my deployment orders. The prosecutor took notes while Patricia explained how this destroyed any chance of her claiming desperation, or a sudden mistake since the evidence showed methodical preparation over weeks. That same afternoon, I got a call from a woman saying she was her mother and that she'd been estranged from her daughter for 8 years, but heard about the case from a nephew. She told me about her gambling starting in college, the lies about tuition money, the stolen credit cards, and how she'd cut contact after she had forged her signature on a car loan. She offered to testify about the pattern of behavior if it would help protect Brandon, saying she'd been waiting for this call for years, knowing her daughter would eventually destroy someone's life. Detective Patterson came by the house 3 days later with boxes of evidence they'd collected, showing me photos of the casino surveillance, the forged documents, and witness statements from everyone involved. He said between the insurance fraud, the identity theft, the forgery, and the child abuse charges for traumatizing Brandon, they had enough for 25 years if a jury convicted on everything. He seemed satisfied, but I just felt empty looking at all that evidence of how thoroughly she'd planned to erase me from existence. My lawyer called that Monday saying the trial date was set for 8 weeks out and explaining that the prosecutor had decided Brandon wouldn't need to testify since they had so much physical evidence and adult witnesses. He walked me through what to expect, how long it might take, and warned me that her public defender would probably push for a plea deal once they saw the mountain of evidence against her. The next week, I got invited to a support group meeting on base for military families dealing with fraud and identity theft, which turned out to be more common than I'd thought. 9 other people sat in that conference room sharing stories about spouses who'd emptied accounts, sold houses, or declared them dead while deployed. And we started meeting every Thursday to share resources and warning signs. One guy had been through something almost identical 5 years earlier and gave me his lawyer's number plus tips on rebuilding credit after identity theft. Derek signed a lease on an apartment across town and asked if he could establish a regular schedule with Brandon since they'd gotten so attached during those 7 months. We worked out Thursday dinners and Saturday afternoons, which Brandon seemed happy about, even though he still looked confused sometimes about why Derek wasn't living with us anymore. I watched them leave together that first Thursday, and Brandon was chattering about school while Derek listened like he always had, and I realized this weird arrangement might actually work. I went back to the pawn shop where the owner remembered me from when I'd found our wedding ring there, and he agreed to hold it for 4 more months if I could pay $25. And if you want more stories told from the truth men live but rarely say out loud, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one.